Welcome to ENside Politics, our weekly podcast on a handful of things you need to know about San Antonio politics. I'm Molly Smith, a City Hall reporter at the San Antonio Express-News. I'm joined today by my colleagues, county government reporter Saul Pink.
Hello.
And business reporter Madison Iszler.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
We just got our look at fundraising in the county judge's race. Saul, what did we learn about how Peter Sakai and Ron Nirenberg are doing in their matchup in the Democratic primary?
Yeah, so the reports came out last Thursday, and when we were looking at these reports, what we were really looking at is kind of to what extent has Nirenberg caught up on what was initially a really big cash disadvantage he had in the last reports that came out in July, kind of right after Nirenberg is finishing up his time at City Hall. He had about $7,000 on hand. That's obviously because there's a $1,000 limit per donation for the mayor's office, as well as, he'd been in a pretty safe mayoral seat. He hadn't been, raising that much money for a competitive race. Meanwhile, you go over to the county, it's kind of no rules, anything flies, there's no limits on campaign donations. And Sakai at the time had $435,000 in the bank. And so we're looking to see how much Nirenberg caught up. And the answer is some, really. In this 6-month period, Nirenberg did outraise Sakai. Nirenberg reported $358,000 in cash donations to Sakai's $244,000. So he did manage to raise a good amount of money, and this time he only started raising money in September. It's worth noting that some of this money he was raising was through a PAC that he created with the state, sort of before he had honed in on county judge, when you reported that he was looking at governor, maybe he was looking at senator. So some of these donations are not necessarily to county judge, but to kind of his political future as a whole, sort of unclear what office he would ultimately seek. But he did outraise Sakai. That said, because Sakai started with such a huge cash advantage, Sakai still has about $200,000 more in the bank than Nirenberg does in this. It's about a month before early voting starts. So as far as cash on hand, Sakai has $563,000 and Nirenberg has $355,000. All of these numbers are as of the 31st of December.
Okay. And who are some of the top donors for both Peter Sakai and then Ron Nirenberg? Sure.
So we saw Nirenberg rely on a few more kind of high dollar big donations. The biggest came from Christian Archer, the kind of longtime Democratic political strategist here in San Antonio. Yeah, it was $50,000. What's interesting is it was October, Archer had circulated a poll that he conducted that he claimed showed Nirenberg beating Sakai in a landslide. I think it was something kind of unheard of. I think it was 52 to 26%. But he did circulate that as kind of evidence that it would be a good move for Nirenberg to challenge Sakai before Nirenberg had announced anything back when it was kind of unclear whether he would go for governor or another office. So that was the biggest donor. We saw a few other big names in there. There was philanthropist Harvey Najum. He actually loaned $100,000 to Nirenberg's campaign, which is substantial, as well as giving a $25,000 donation. Philanthropist Gordon Hartman also gave $25,000. So that right there between those three people is $100,000 of the roughly $350,000 that he raised. So we're seeing him lean on these high dollar donations.
So not kind of broad voter support that we're seeing.
Sure,
in terms of like small dollar donors. It's kind of these one or a handful of kind of big donors.
Yeah, sure. They're definitely sort of carrying if you look through his report, there are, $50 donations, $100 donations, and so on. But yeah, you're obviously seeing, almost a third coming from three people. Some other interesting ones worth noting, you had Nelson Wolff in there actually from his still existing campaign account that he has, I believe, a 6-year runway to spend after leaving office. He gave $2,500. You had former city manager Cheryl Scully in there. Kevin Wolff, Nelson Wolff's son, gave $1,000. So yeah, we saw kind of an array of names in Nirenberg's campaign finance report, but certainly leaning on a few bigger donations.
And then who are some of those standout names in Sakai's?
Yeah, so Sakai, his biggest donors gave $10,000. So compared to the $50,000 from Christian Archer, there was Pearl founder Kit Goldsberry, who gave $10,000. Tulos Wells, who's the co-chair of the Tobin Endowment, gave $10,000. those were, the two biggest ones. There were a couple other interesting ones to look at. We saw, albeit small, $2,000 donation from the PAC for the San Antonio Firefighters Union. They later on endorsed Sakai's reelection bid, but their donation was actually in September, sort of before it was really at all clear that we'd be in this competitive Democratic primary. There were a few of the leaders from University Health, the county-funded hospital system, for which, of course, Commissioner's Court approves their budget and tax rate in there. But yeah, those two $10,000 donations were the biggest ones.
And it's probably worth noting that at least right now, Nuremberg, despite raising more, doesn't really appear to have kind of broad support from the city or the county's business community. That's something he struggled with early on in his term as mayor. In his 2017 campaign, he kind of ran as a environmentalist, really kind of positioned himself as very liberal, ended up not being so liberal, but really only saw, I think, business people back him in his final two runs. So we're not really seeing that yet.
Right.
Saul, you've also reported on issues with the county's voter registration system. Take us back a little bit and remind us why the county is in the place it's in now, where it's trying to find new software to process voter registrations.
Yeah, so it goes back to the summer, and it kind of requires going into very much the minutia of how counties process voter registrations. But in short, any county has a software that they use to store data of their voter rolls, and they basically use it to take registered voters, whether that's people registering online or largely people who have registered through new or renewed driver's license. And it takes their information, verifies it, and then makes sure their address is matched to the correct precinct. So therefore, they get the correct ballot at the polls. They're voting for the right commissioner precinct, state house districts, et cetera. Now, there is a state system. It's called Team Texas Elections Administration Management System that a lot of the smaller counties use to do this. But historically, bigger counties like Bexar County outsource this. They contract with one of what was 3 state-approved vendors to do this. And that's for an array of reasons, just, a bigger capability to store data, all kinds of reasons why a bigger county says they need bigger capabilities here. Now, over the summer, the county's contractor called VoteTech, a California-based firm, announced it was going out of business. They had experienced some financial issues over the years. And so that is what led to a pretty big backlog in voter registrations ahead of the November election, because the county essentially had to pause processing them and temporarily transition to the state's team system, which was also undergoing updates at the time. So the bottom line is we sort of saw about 70,000 voter registration backlog in the weeks before the November 4th election. Of course, the elections department did work through all of those, and all those folks did get their registrations processed. They used some extra funds to hire temporary staff to do it. So now we turn to what happened yesterday with the new vendor. Over the summer, county commissioners voted to set aside $1.5 million in the new budget to pay for this new vendor. It's a Florida company called VR Systems, as well as direct staff to put together a contract. They're, of course, one of just 2 vendors now that the state approves to do this.
Okay.
So there's not a major kind of open bidding process required. And yeah, the contract just hadn't come up since then in these commissioners' court meetings that happen every 2 weeks. I mean, of course, these things can take a while. It's not quite clear why. And so it got to the point where it was clear a couple of weeks ago that the county would continue to use the state's team system for the March primary, but sort of that kind of raised concerns about whether they should have a bigger sense of urgency on this for a contract that hadn't come up. And so what happened at yesterday's meeting was that Justin Rodriguez, the Precinct 2 commissioner, last week he put what's called kind of a late filed item on the agenda for this contract, that allows you to put an item on the agenda past the deadline you had to give it to county staff to put on the agenda. And it was this contract with VR Systems that sort of in the day before, in the morning of the meeting, Precinct 4 Commissioner Tommy Calvert raised a lot of concerns about that it had, what he called quote unquote poison pills in it that were going to make it difficult for VR Systems to agree to. And actually what happened was one of the top executives at VR Systems from the company actually flew in from Florida and told commissioners at the meeting yesterday that it was very unlikely that they would accept this contract. There were a few reasons for it. There were some
what are those kind of quote unquote poison pills?
There were some clauses in there that that sort of the way VR Systems, the contractor, saw it, excessively held them accountable for issues with the state system. So back to the minutia here, the county still has to report its voter rolls to the state. So it still has to upload some data to that state team system. And the contract required kind of that VR Systems create a software that operates in conjunction with the state system. And there were some clauses in there that kind of, it was something along the lines of if there was an issue with team and if the private contractor didn't restore full operability within 12 hours, if it's near an election period, the county can just terminate the contract. Kind of things like that are what they pointed to. The chief operating officer, Ben Martin, had also just said that this seemed rushed. Like usually they iron out all the quirks of a contract before the county commissioners vote on it. This company has contracts with Tarrant County, contracts with El Paso County, 15 counties in Texas, I believe. So it's nothing particularly new for them. So he just also said he was surprised at kind of the rushed nature of it. And
when did he find out that they were going to be voting on it?
He said he found out last Friday. So what is that, 4 days before the meeting? And so, yeah, it definitely was a quick process. But to finish off, what ultimately happened was commissioners discussed it in executive session at the end of yesterday's meeting. And, when they came back, they just said that they did not plan to take action on it. And so it sort of remains to be seen when it'll come up again. But commissioners and Judge Sakai have said that they're hoping their goal now is to have it ready for what's going to be a pretty high turnout in the November midterms.
So still going with the same company, just it sounds like actually talking to them ahead of time about the contract. I think some more
quirks need to be ironed out. Yeah, is my sense of what's going on.
What was kind of the reason, if any, that county staff gave for why they, hadn't discussed this with the company, or even what Commissioner Rodriguez had said about why put up a contract if it hasn't really been gone through this due diligence process?
That's still kind of unclear. I mean, it definitely wasn't sort of originally scheduled to go on this agenda until there was a late filed item put in. But yeah, it is unclear. It's sort of the reasoning, for example, when I spoke with Commissioner Rodriguez yesterday, is just that, at the end of the day, the county is trying to protect their own interest and the contractors trying to have their interest in mind in the contract. So it might just be that negotiations need to continue and that they hadn't been ironed out yet. But that's still kind of unclear sort of what went wrong.
What did Judge Sakai kind of say about all of this? I know you've noted he's been a bit more vocal now that he's kind of running for re-election on matters. Did he weigh in at all?
So what's interesting, they didn't really talk about it at the meeting, but I did speak with Judge Sakai after. And I mean, his biggest message was kind of expressing confidence that, everything will be okay for the March election. These voter registrations will be processed and that, when it comes up, they will vote on it. He sort of was trying to express confidence that the March election will be all right with the system that they have now. And, that the county will try to get this done before November.
Are they facing, I know before November's election, there were, like you said, a lot of these backlogged registrations that needed to be processed. Are we seeing that right now? Or are there any glitches in terms of people who are still registering to kind of vote? Yeah,
so there is a much, much smaller backlog right now. I think the most recent numbers are around 6,000 voter registrations. The reasons for that seem to be that, the county is still using the state system, which they've complained runs a little more slowly. And they're just not able to process registrations as fast. That said, I mean, if you're a voter getting ready to vote in March, it's worth noting that there was a 70,000 voter backlog in November, and sort of everything did get processed at the end of the day. So there is a backlog, but I mean, I think the message the county is giving is that they will be able to work through these registrations, before the election, and the deadline to register is February 2nd.
Switching gears a little bit and turning to one of our favorite topics on this podcast, Project Marvel, the Downtown Sports and Entertainment District. City Council discussed the district last week. It's the first time they talked about it publicly since that November election, where about 52% of voters approved using county tax dollars to help fund this $1.3 billion Spurs Arena at Hemisphere. The city's $489 million contribution was tied to the measure's passage. So Madison, what did we learn from that discussion, and what parts of the sports district is the city focusing on in this coming year?
Yeah, so city staff laid out essentially their priorities for this coming year. The Sports and Entertainment District has a lot of different components. There's the Spurs Arena, which you just mentioned. There's expanding the convention center. There's redoing the Alamo Dome. There's turning the former Wood Courthouse, which would be near the arena, into an event venue. And then there's building all the infrastructure around it, roads, ramps, figuring out parking, all of that needs to happen to make the area a more seamless experience for pedestrians and for drivers. And so city staff said that their priorities for this coming year are expanding the convention center, the next steps with the Spurs Arena, and the infrastructure piece. With the convention center, they're trying to finalize how much they would expand it by, the square footage, and then also the cost and the timeline. Last year, the city had said it would be about $750 million to expand it by up to 200,000 square feet. They're planning to come back to council later this year with those details hashed out. With the Spurs Arena, the city doesn't yet own the land where the arena would go. It's expected to go at the former Institute of Texas and Culture site. That building was torn down last year, early this year. And so UTSA currently owns that site. The city has the exclusive right to buy it or lease it, but that transaction hasn't happened. So city staff also said they're planning to start negotiations with UTSA. They've said it could cost around $60 million, but both sides are planning to get appraisals to figure out what that price will be. And obviously they need to shore that up before construction could start.
And do they want that sale to close by the end of 2026?
Yes, ideally. Yes. The next steps with the Spurs piece would also be the Spurs hiring developers and figuring out what exactly is going to be built around the arena. Mixed-use development is part of the non-binding term sheet that's tied essentially to the financing for the arena or parts of the financing. And so that's the next step for the Spurs. There are also a ton of other agreements that need to be hashed out. A lease for the new arena, development agreements, just a number of other things. And so the city is also planning to work on that this year. And then lastly, the infrastructure piece. There was some discussion about a land bridge over I-37 connecting downtown to the Alamo Dome on the east side. I know a lot of our readers were very interested in that. I got a lot of emails about it. That is on the back burner for now. The city said last week that it was not quite dependent, but a lot of the funding for it was expected to come from the federal government, and that's up in the air. But the city does still want to look at how to better connect downtown and the east side. What would that look like in terms of safer aspects for pedestrians, how to get people in and out? Parking is another huge question. There are a lot of parking garages downtown. Some are within a short walking distance. And so the city is also planning to look at, is there enough parking, essentially? Does more parking need to be built? And if so, where and how that would get built?
I know that the city at one point had talked about building the second convention center hotel, and there was a lot of interest in it because it was going to be built on the site of SAWS's current chilled water plant. This is what provides cold water to a bunch of the facilities downtown, including the convention center. Mm-hmm. What's the timeline on that? Is that still planned?
So the city still wants to look at that, but it's definitely been pushed back. That's in part because of what's going to happen with the SAWS chilled water plant, figuring out the cost of moving that, where it would move, and then how to service essentially the city facilities. So last week, the city said, we're pushing that back. We're not going to work on that primarily, at least in the next year. And another piece that's been pushed back is the Alamo Dome. One of the components of Project Marvel that's been envisioned is a redo of the Alamo Dome, a major renovation. And the city has pushed that back about a decade. So 2035 is probably when they'll look at that. City staff did say last week that they want to figure out how much money needs to be allocated to keep the Alamo Dome functioning. they're going to look at that this year, but a major renovation is on the back burner for now.
With going back to the convention center hotel, has the city been able to kind of make the case yet for whether there's actually a demand for more hotel space? I know the Monarch is about to open. There's more hotels kind of in the mix. I mean, does San Antonio need like another hotel in that area?
I think that's the main question that the city needs to answer with the second convention center hotel, especially depending on how it would be financed. In their descriptions of how different pieces of Project Marvel would be funded, they have said that private investment essentially could be used for the hotel, but it's unclear if there's actually demand for it because, as you said, we have a lot of hotels already downtown. We have a lot more hotels coming online downtown, and it's been tough lately for the hospitality industry. Room rates have been kind of sluggish. Some visitors aren't coming for various reasons. And so one of the things that the city's planning to do with the hotel and also the other projects that we've talked about is study, essentially, the cost, the demand, and if that is worthwhile.
Of all of these kind of pieces, which one do you think they're going to break ground on first?
It seems like the convention center is a top priority. The city has said that they want to be able to attract more large events. Visit San Antonio, which is the tourism organization that markets San Antonio to convention planners, has said they want more space. And so that definitely seems like a priority. The Spurs Arena is also a priority for the city. The Spurs have a lease with the county for the Frost Bank Center that runs through 2032, and that's roughly the time frame that they've talked about with when a new arena could be built. And so those to me seem like the big priorities.
Does the city need to acquire, aside from the ITC site, any more land for the sports and entertainment district?
Yes. So the city is trying to buy 3 properties essentially around Hemisphere. One is an office building that's next to the Wood Courthouse. It's kind of this big square rectangle-ish building that the federal government has had offices in for a while. And then there are 2 parking lots across the street, across Cesar Chavez. And so those properties would be used for the mixed-use development that the Spurs are planning to build around the arena. Those sites are crucial to that. And so last week, City Council gave city staff approval to basically finalize that agreement. That's expected to close also by the end of the year.
What can we expect, do you think, from Mayor Jones when over this next year when they're kind of, I guess, making some of these big decisions and especially finalizing parts of this deal with the Spurs?
Mayor Jones hinted at last week's discussion that there are aspects of the deal, the non-binding term sheet with the Spurs, that she might want to revisit. In the past, she's talked about revenue sharing, which the Spurs have said is off the table. Mm-hmm. She's talked basically about how to ensure that the city gets what they want from this deal and if there's more that they could get. The term sheet is non-binding, as she also pointed out next week, and it was pitched to voters as a non-binding deal, meaning it's not shored up, it hasn't closed. All the agreements still have to be negotiated. But at last week's meeting, several council members pushed back on that. Councilwoman Marina Alderete-Gavito and also Councilman Mark White basically said reopening this deal, trying to add a bunch of new things to it, is bad for business. They said the city negotiated in good faith, the Spurs did, the county did, and so it would be a bad look, essentially, to business leaders who might be interested in expanding in San Antonio, might want to do something with the city or the county to reopen that. And the mayor, again, pointed out it's non-binding.
Do you think the mayor has any kind of support among the 10 council members for pushing the Spurs to, I guess, sweeten the deal or give the city more?
Councilman Jalen McKee-Rodriguez at last week's meeting also echoed what Jones had said about just the nature of the deal and how it was presented to voters in the lead up to that November election. He said city staff, people at meetings, essentially town halls that were held leading up to the election, described it to voters as non-binding, as something that wasn't finalized. And so he seems to be maybe in line with what Mayor Jones wants. It's unclear what exactly she would want to negotiate, what aspects. She has brought up the revenue sharing before, but it's been a little while since then, and the Spurs have said that's a no-go. But he certainly seems to side with her in that. But as far as majority support, it doesn't seem at this point that there's majority appetite for wanting to really reshape a lot of what was outlined in the term sheet.
Has the mayor at all brought up the community benefits agreement? This is the $75 million that the Spurs have said to the city they will give them over the 30-year term of the lease, so about $2.5 million a year. Has she kind of set her sights on that at all, or still that's not really something? She's still really fixated on kind of the revenue sharing.
There was some discussion of that last week. I think it has yet to be hammered out what she and what other council members want that money to be used for. It's not a lot per year. Mm-hmm. You're limited in what you're able to do with that much. And so I think that council has yet to have a discussion about what the priority should be for that money and how to allocate it.
And then I know they also talked about the Missions Baseball Stadium. This is not part of maybe Project Marvel per se, but it's still, I think, part of this overall plan to have kind of more entertainment options downtown. This site would be near San Pedro Creek Culture Park. Mm-hmm. What kind of do we know about that? I know they're on a bit tighter of a timeline than the Spurs of kind of what we can expect with this.
Yes. So the Missions are on, they've said, a 2028 deadline to have a new stadium open and ready for the next Mission season. They're currently playing at Nelson Wolff Stadium out on the west side. That's not up to Major League Baseball standards that were changed a couple of years ago. And so that's the impetus for wanting to build a new ballpark downtown. Some of the owners of the Missions are the founders of Weston Urban, a major development firm that owns a lot of parcels near where the stadium would go, and also would be in charge of the development that's going to go around the ballpark that would help finance it. At this point, the city was initially expecting to put out bonds for that project in November. That was the tentative timeline. That's been pushed back to the summer. That's in part because until last year, the owners of the Missions had not shored up a deal with SAISD for the last piece of land. The county ended up getting involved in that and basically acquired the land in kind of a complex deal. And so now that that's been finalized, things are moving forward, they've said, but that took longer than expected.
And that's like a parking lot near Fox Tech High School?
Yes. A little parking lot that SAISD had owned for a while near the school. That's kind of right in the footprint of where the ballpark would go. The bonds, in order for the city to issue the bonds, Weston Urban has to have the first phase of the project designed and financed, and I believe the second piece also designed in order for the city to issue the bonds. So the city is also waiting on the finalization of those details.
I know the mayor has also noted that this deal with the Missions is also non-binding. Any thoughts on parts of that deal that we might see her try to renegotiate, or that would even be up for a renegotiation?
Yeah, it's unclear what exactly she wants to redo in that deal as well. She's talked about housing before, and she's talked about wanting a broader master plan for downtown, as the city has all of these major projects happening, from the ballpark, which is kind of at one end, down to the Spurs Arena and everything in between, and wanting something that makes things more cohesive, perhaps, is a good way of putting it. But the housing piece would be tough because the financing is tied to development guarantees, essentially. So with the development around the arena and then also the ballpark, they have to meet a certain taxable value. And so depending on the housing that's built, it can be a little bit more difficult to meet that taxable value. But
if you have affordable units in there versus like market rate units.
Yes. And so I think that if that's something that she wants, that would have to be looked at.
Do you think she's also going to try to push for naming rights, revenue sharing, or I guess revenue sharing with the Missions?
She's not brought it up yet, but it certainly could be a possibility. I think she seems interested with both of these deals in figuring out how the city can get revenue as the city's dealt with budget difficulties. And so these could be a source, she said, to help balance things there.
Well, a lot to follow up on in the coming weeks and months.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you both for joining us. Thank you for listening, watching. If you haven't already signed up for our free weekly politics newsletter, you can find the link to do so in our show notes, and we will see you back here next week.